All right, so Seth, I think to start it all off, the raid is actually called the Tokyo Raid. So
Right.
I wanted to know why that was conducted at all and why it's more commonly known as the Doolittle Raid.
Well, the raid was it was something that was thought up. There's a common misconception that the Doolittle Raid, the Tokyo Raid, whatever you want to call it, was the idea of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and that's just not really the case. Um, it was conceived by a naval officer, Captain Lowe, who was an anti-submarine patrol officer, actually, in January of 1942. And the reason that the raid was ever even thought up and eventually, obviously, conducted was because the first thing that the United States wanted to do to the Japanese was to strike back at them. Of course, the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941 and dealt a huge blow to our Pacific Fleet and the American morale. And the one thing that the United States was not doing well in the Pacific War, especially in the first few months of the war, was winning. We weren't winning at all. We weren't really doing much good at all. The Japanese were pretty much running wild through the Pacific. They'd captured Wake, Guam. They were in the Philippines. They'd captured a good bit of it. And of course, Philippines would fall in May of 1942, which is obviously even after the raid. But the main reason that the raid was thought up and eventually conducted was to bring up American morale, to raise American morale, and to also tell the Japanese and show the Japanese physically that they were not invincible, that they were not untouchable. We could strike them at any time that we really wanted to. And it had far-reaching effects, and we can talk about those in just a few minutes. But the reason it's called the Doolittle Raid is, of course, because of the man who led it. At the time, Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, and Jonna's going to talk a lot more about him than I will, but Colonel Jimmy Doolittle was one of the most famous aviators in the United States. And of course, he led the raid. He was a huge participant in the planning of the event. And he was the first pilot to take off of the Carrier Hornet on the morning of April 18th. And he was definitely the most famous aviator of the group, and rightfully so. And that's why we've come to call it the Doolittle. Well, one of the reasons we've come to call it the Doolittle Raid.
You shared some pictures when the task force actually set sail. Can you tell us what the role of the Navy was and what the mission of the raiders and what their targets were?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So the funny thing is this raid was supposed to be super top secret. Nobody was supposed to know anything about it and all this other stuff. So the raiders fly from Eglin in Florida, and they fly over to California. They land in McClellan Field, and from there, their airplanes go under further modification for the raid. They wanted to lighten these birds as much as possible and put as much fuel in these things as they could to get them to where they needed to go. And then they flew to NAS Alameda, and they were loaded aboard the Hornet via crane. And you see this in 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. They portray this actually very accurately. And all these B-25s, 16 Army B-25s were on the deck of the Hornet, the flight deck of the Hornet, and this is a top secret mission. And the Hornet sat in the middle of San Francisco Harbor for 2 days with all these B-25s on the flight deck for all the world to see. So it was top secret. Nobody knew where they were going, but it was pretty obvious that something was afoot. But they leave San Francisco, and the Hornet does, and they rendezvous. The Hornet rendezvous with another task force, Navy task force, and it's under the command of Admiral William F. Halsey, Bull Halsey. And he's aboard the carrier Enterprise, CV-6. And the task force consists of about 15 ships, mostly cruisers and destroyers, and a couple of oilers, and then of course the Enterprise and the Hornet. And they rendezvous, and they're escorting the Hornet because they're the main vessel out as close to Japan as possible. And at one point, after the oilers refuel the Hornet and the Enterprise and the cruisers, the destroyers and the oilers turn around and turn tail and run back to Pearl, and it's the two carriers and the cruisers, and they open throttle up to about 20 knots through a heavy sea to get to Japan, as close to Japan as possible before they launch the airplanes. They were set to launch on April 18th anyway. And of course, the famous story is that the task force was discovered by Japanese picket boats. And what the picture you're seeing right here is the cruiser Nashville, USS Nashville, opening fire on one of the Japanese picket boats. And the Japanese picket boat, number 23 Nito Maru was the name of the picket boat, which was sunk by naval gunfire by the Nashville, and was also attacked by aircraft from the Enterprise. She was broadcasting a radio transmission saying that there was an American task force at sea and Japan was under imminent threat of attack. So she had broadcast a warning to Japan, and the United States, the Navy, of course, were picking up the radio signals, and they sunk the boat. But that caused the plans to kind of go awry after that. They had to launch 650 or 750 miles, 650 nautical miles, 750 miles further out from Japan than they'd initially wanted to, which of course threw everything as far as where the raiders were going to land. Of course, the initial plan was the raiders were going to land in friendly China and then refuel and fly further into China and then get back, eventually to American in American hands. But because they had to launch so much earlier and so much further out, that plan was gone. The 25s did not have the range, even though they had the range to get to Japan. They did not have the range to get to where they initially wanted to go, and that caused all kinds of trouble later on. Every airplane that was a part of the raid had to ditch or crashed, and it caused several people to be injured. But the targets that it's called the Tokyo Raid for obvious reasons. Tokyo is the capital of Japan, but there were several targets that were. It wasn't just Tokyo that they bombed. There were industrial targets in Yokohama, Nagoya, Kanagawa, Kobe, and Osaka. And Tokyo, obviously, were all targets of the raid. They were all industrial targets, and I emphasize that because Jimmy Doolittle, the Army Air Forces, or at the time Army Air Corps, made it abundantly clear that they were bombing industrial targets because they didn't want to give the Japanese any kind of propaganda ability to say that we bombed hospitals and schools and things like that, which they certainly would have used had we done so. Now, that being said, of course, when you're bombing a city that's as tight as Tokyo and places like that, there are going to be innocents that are killed, and there were. There were people that were harmed, casualties of war, if you will.
Right. Well, we've actually got some questions coming in from our viewers right now, and one was asking about when they had to make those changes and when they knew that they were spotted by those picket ships. In your experience in collecting oral histories, did any of the men and the raiders tell you how they were feeling when they got the word that they were going to have to launch early?
Oh yeah, all of them did. all of them knew what was going on. Every single one of them, from the pilots to the co-pilots to the flight engineer, top turret gunners, they all knew that they were launching early. They all knew that it was significantly further away than initially had been planned. And at that point, I can't say everybody that was on the raid, but the guys that I knew and the guys that friends of mine and fellow historians knew, they all said that at that point they thought it was a suicide mission. They felt like they had a pretty good chance prior to being discovered and prior to launching 750 miles, 650 nautical out earlier than they needed to. They thought that they had a pretty good chance to all get through it okay. But once they had to launch that much further out, at that point, they really figured. I remember Dave Jones telling me, he's like, "Oh yeah, we thought this was it. This is a suicide mission. We volunteered for this, but we're going to do it anyway." And of course, they did.
Wow, that just takes my breath away just hearing that. I think this is a good time to show your video that you shared about Davy Jones. That way, our viewers can see one of the raiders actually talking about it in his own words.
Mm-hmm.
He and his crew returned to the U.S. with the help of Chinese allies. The Doolittle Raid inflicted minimal material damage to its targets. It provided a huge boost in morale, however, for the American people in the dark early days of the Pacific War. Jones was later sent to the European Theater of Operations, where he was shot down and captured. During his time as a prisoner of war in Stalag Luft 3, he became one of the principal tunnel diggers whose story was turned into the Hollywood movie, The Great Escape.
Wow, that was
David M. Jones was one of the original.
So that story by Davy Jones, he mentioned some of the results of the raid, just like you had talked about earlier. But can you tell us how the raid affected the U.S. and Japan as they moved forward in the war?
Yeah, absolutely. So the raid, had, like General Jones said, and he was, or the narrator said, they didn't do much physical damage. They did obviously attack targets, and they did inflict casualties and damage on the Japanese and the cities in which they bombed. But the effects for the raid were much farther reaching than that. For the United States in particular, it did what it was designed to do, which was to boost American morale. I mean, this thing flashed across headlines from coast to coast, really all over the world, right after it happened. You know what I mean? Tokyo, this is the capital of the enemy that bombed us, was bombed by our people. And this was the strike back at Japan that the people of the United States had been waiting for. This boosted American morale tremendously. And you got to remember, this is in the depths of the fall of the Philippines. I mean, the Philippines are under siege. You know, Bataan is gone. Again, Corregidor surrenders at the beginning of May. So, I mean, things are not going good. And this does exactly what it was designed to do, which is to boost the American morale. Now, for Japan, this had even much further reaching effects than it did for the United States. And the reason for that are many, not the least of which is that the Japanese were no fools. You know, they were not stupid. They knew where those B-25s had come from. Even though they were Army airplanes, they were fully aware that they had been launched from an aircraft carrier. They knew that the United States did not have any bases anywhere near Japan that could have gotten those airplanes to where they were, or to where they bombed. And they knew they came from an American aircraft carrier. And the Japanese were also fully aware, obviously, that they missed the American aircraft carriers in the attack on Pearl Harbor, which were the main targets, or some of the main targets, and not all of them, obviously. But so that all that did was allow the Japanese to approve Japanese Admiral Yamamoto, Isoroku Yamamoto's plan to lure the American aircraft carriers out and fight them in one final decisive battle, basically ambush the American aircraft carriers, destroy them. That way the Japanese could have a free hand in the Pacific. And of course that resulted in the Battle of Midway, which obviously did not go Japan's way. On June 4th, 1942, in a span of 4 minutes, we set 3 Japanese aircraft carriers afire, set the 4th one afire that afternoon. And that night and into the morning of the 5th, they were all either scuttled or sunk. So we sank 4 of the 6 Japanese aircraft carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor at Midway, and that was a direct result of the Doolittle Raid. Japan probably would not have approved Yamamoto's plan had the raid not occurred, and showed that the American aircraft carriers were a significant thorn in Japan's side. Of course, the farthest reaching effects were that, but some of the harshest effects actually fell upon the Chinese. As General Jones and the narrator in that video said, and as I said earlier, the raiders, after they attacked Japan, they headed to China, and they tried to land, or they did land, or crash, or whatever, bail out over friendly lines in China. The Japanese, again, fully aware that the Chinese were helping the raiders get out. They were extraditing them. They tended to them medically. They'd fed them and taken care of them, hid them. They took their revenge on the Chinese almost instantaneously. Over 10,000 Chinese were killed in the search for the raiders. And that was just when the Japanese were searching for the raiders.
Wow.
Over 10,000 Chinese were killed. And of course, there's no exact number, but after that, there was a 3-month reign of terror that the Japanese did inflict on the Chinese, where it's an estimated over 250,000 Chinese were murdered by the Japanese as a retaliation for helping the Americans during the Doolittle Raid.
One of our viewers, Fred, he was asking, do you know where they landed in China? What location it was?
All over the place.
All over.
After they, there's really they had places where they were supposed to land, and I don't recall where the initial places where they were going to land had everything gone exactly to plan where. I don't remember, but I mean they were scattered to all 4 corners of the map as far as China is concerned, because they were flying in bad weather, and by the time they got to China, it was night. It's pitch black night. They're flying through mountainous terrain. Some of them are flying over the beach, and they literally, after they attacked Japan, they just kind of went, and they went all over the place. And they were headed to China for sure. Actually, one airplane went to Vladivostok, Russia, into the Soviet Union.
Wow.
The only one that did that. But they were all over the map.
Oh, well, thank you for that. We have a lot more questions. I think I'm going to have to save those for the Q&A, but I wanted to show the viewers a little bit more what some of the pictures. You had the picture of the raiders outside this cave, and we talked a little bit about the result of what happened to the Chinese people that aided them. But do you have any more that you wanted to share about this particular picture, Seth?
Yeah. Well, it's a bunch of guys in that picture, obviously. It's all raiders. If you look in the back row, fourth from left. So That one right there with the mustache, that's Davy Jones.
Mm-hmm.
That's the guy you just heard from. That's the future tunnel digger at Sagan, and that's General Jones, or Captain Jones at the time, later General Jones. And I think that's all of his crew. His co-pilot, if I'm not mistaken, is the guy furthest on the right, standing up there. But that's a great gaggle of Raiders there that were.
Question and answer session with our viewers. So I'm going to start with Seth. One of the questions was the raid as important to the overall war effort as was portrayed in the months after the war and in popular memory?
Yes and no. Yeah, it was, because, like I said initially, it was important because of the far-reaching effects that it had for the United States and Japan. If the raid had not been conducted, and again, as I said, the Japanese were fully aware that the airplanes had come from an American aircraft carrier. Had that not occurred, Yamamoto's plan for the Midway operation probably would not have been approved. I mean, it was a clustered mess anyway, between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army. They didn't want to work together, especially for Midway. But had the raid not occurred, Yamamoto would have had a larger fight on his hands. I'm not saying it would not have been approved, but it's very likely that it would not have been approved. And of course, if Midway doesn't happen, I'm not saying that we don't win the war, but it would have taken a lot longer, and it would have cost a lot more American lives and Japanese lives, and Chinese and British and Australians and Dutch. I mean, I could go on, and Filipinos, I could go on and on, but it would have been a costlier war and longer war. So the Doolittle Raid is important then, and it's important now because of the far-reaching effects, specifically the Battle of Midway.
I had a question from Wyatt that concerns the Midway. He was wondering if the movie that was just made about Midway depicted how the Japanese punished the Chinese after the raid. Was that correct?
Oh yeah, but the movie that came out just last year, 2019, was actually a pretty good movie too. It did not show. It wasn't about Doolittle Raid, it was about Enterprise Air Group. But besides that, it showed a little bit of the effects of the raid, with the retaliation. But there are horrible, gory, very visceral details of what the Japanese did to the Chinese that, if you want to know, you can look it up and find it out. It's just suffice it to say that, as I said, 10,000 people-ish were killed when they were just searching for the raiders, meaning that the Japanese would go into towns and they'd kill everybody and burn the town down. I mean, that's what they would do, and a lot worse. And then after that, there was a 3-month, as the Chinese call it, the Reign of Terror, in which the Japanese for 3 months basically went through the countryside like scorched earth. I mean, I'm talking, like Hannibal, and just went through there and killed and destroyed everything. Over 250,000 Chinese lost their lives because of this.
We had a question from Lee regarding that. So did the U.S. leadership understand the potential consequences to the Chinese once the raiders landed in China?
Yes, and the Chinese did too. The Chinese were asked before the raid. We didn't just plop them in. The raiders, that is. The Chinese government, Chiang Kai-shek, was asked before the raid, hey, can we come here? can we put our people here? And the Chinese agreed, and they very happily agreed, because the Japanese were a common enemy. They hated them, frankly, probably more than we did. And they were more than eager to help our people out. And after the event and all the killing that took place after the event, Chiang Kai-shek was very vocal about the suffering of his people at the hands of the Japanese because of the raid. So yeah, we knew it was going to be bad for them. They did too. Okay. The Chinese, that is. And so yeah, it was a mutual agreement that unfortunately just was very bloody.
I have some technical questions about the battle. The first one is, what were the modifications that they had to make to the B-25 in order to take off from a carrier?
So there were quite a few, and I'm looking through my notes because I wrote them all down because there were so many. The main thing is that they wanted to strip the airplanes of weight, of excessive weight. One of the things they took out, the 25 had a lower turret, had a not a ball turret, but a lower turret. They took that out. They took the tail guns out. You know, they infamously put 2 black broomsticks in the tail of the airplane to basically be fake tail guns, and that is true. That did happen. They removed excessive weight inside the airplane. They removed the Norden bomb sight, not the least of which because it was heavy, but also because it was top secret. They didn't want the Japanese to get a hold of the Norden bomb sight. They crafted, I forget which of the raiders crafted it, I don't recall anymore. Basically took a piece of aluminum and made a bomb sight that cost about 10 cents. And that's what they used on the raid. And then they put collapsible fuel tanks in the B-25s to get the extra fuel range needed to get them to China after they bombed Japan. And of course, when they launched, because they had to launch so early, there's a scene in 30 Seconds Over Tokyo that is very, very accurate, where they're literally throwing metal tins of fuel into the airplanes because they needed that extra gas. And that is very true. That's what they did. They just tossed as many as they crammed as many as they could in the birds to get them as far as they could.
Now, after the question from Mike is, after they crashed, were there any artifacts that were recovered from the crash sites?
No, I don't know. Jonna could probably answer that better than me. I would imagine Colonel Doolittle brought something back. But I really don't know, because I mean, you got to remember, these guys they're trying to get the heck out of there. They're trying to get back to friendly lines and save their neck. I don't think they were too concerned about pulling things out of an airplane. Now, that doesn't mean that the Chinese didn't. I have heard that there are pieces of some of the Doolittle Raid airplanes. Where they are, God knows. I have no clue. But I really can't answer that. Unfortunately, I wish I could, but I don't know.
Jonna, in your associations with the Raiders, have you heard of any artifacts that have been collected?
There was a gentleman by the name of Moon that returned to China on an expedition, a number of them, and recovered things from different crash sites. So there are pieces of airplanes and things that have made their way back to the United States, but I don't believe anyone specifically from the raid really took the time to bring back anything.
Mm-hmm. I can see that would not be a top priority at that moment. I have a question from